The year 1066, and across the North Sea, the last great Viking king was preparing for what would become history's final chapter of Norse conquest. His name was Harald Hardrada, and he was no ordinary warrior. This was the man who had commanded the Byzantine emperor's elite guard, who had conquered Sicily from Arab territories and had earned gold and glory in battles across 3 continents. Now, in September, he was coming for England. But Harold wasn't sailing alone. Beside him stood a figure whose presence made this invasion even more devastating. The king's own exiled brother, Tostig Godwinson, a personal betrayal. Family, vengeance, and the English crown were about to collide on English soil in a battle so brutal, so decisive, that it would end an entire age of history. This is the story of Stamford Bridge, where Viking dreams died in the mud, where English brothers fought English brothers, and where the thunder of Norse warriors met their final, bloody end. What you're about to witness isn't just another medieval battle. It's the desperate gamble when the old world crashed into the new, when centuries of Viking terror met their match, and when one king's fated change, Harald Hardrada, stood nearly 7 feet tall, a giant among men, even among giants. His weathered hands gripped swords from 3 continents. His pale eyes had seen empires rise and fall. The Byzantines called him the Thunderbolt of the North. He was harder than iron itself. People whispered that he was less than winter, more ruthless than just another raider. He was the last Viking of a dying age, the final burning ambition of Norse flame. Before his throne, Harold had wandered the medieval world as a mercenary and a conqueror. He commanded the emperor's personal Varangian Guard in Constantinople. He battled Arab pirates in the Mediterranean, fought Viking warriors, rode alongside Norman knights in Sicily, and accumulated wealth beyond imagination. Every drop of blood spilled had been building toward this moment. Norway's ambition wasn't enough for what his predecessor Canute had held once, an empire stretching from Norway, Denmark to England. But Harold's path had been paved by betrayal. The longships approached him as he was sitting beside Tostig Godwinson, once Earl of Northumbria. More importantly, he was in England. The story of how these 2 brothers became enemies is a brutal tale of politics, pride, and the harsh realities of medieval power. Tostig had ruled Northumbria with an iron fist, introducing order through frontier methods found unbearably harsh by his subjects. By 1065, the Northumbrians had endured enough. They rose in open rebellion, declaring Tostig an outlaw and choosing a new earl to replace him. When the rebels marched south demanding Tostig's removal, they were met by his own brother Harold, who already faced an impossible choice. England needed only one thing: no civil war in the north. Harold chose England's survival. He persuaded King Edward the Confessor to grant the rebels' demands. Tostig was stripped of his lands, outlawed, and forced into exile. The tension at their meeting must have been electric. Tostig publicly accused Harold of fomenting the rebellion against him. Harold saw the greater good, but Tostig saw only betrayal. Consumed by rage and thirst for vengeance, Tostig began plotting his return. He made contact with Harald Hardrada. Their alliance was forged in the fires of mutual ambition. Harold wanted England, Tostig wanted revenge. Together, they would tear England apart. The invasion fleet assembled in Norway during the summer of 1066 was unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. 300 longships stretched across the harbor, 9,000 warriors, packed between dragon-headed prows and 7 vessels armed with axes, swords that had tasted blood from 1,000 battles. These were men who had never known defeat. They had conquered half the known world from Russia to Sicily, and bore the unshakable confidence of centuries of earlier raiders. Harold's army wasn't the desperate force of earlier raiders. This was a professional force of hardened veterans. Many had fought beside him in the Byzantine campaigns. Others had fought in the endless wars between Norway and Denmark. They carried round shields painted with raven banners, wore mail shirts that gleamed like silver scales. They spoke harsh dialects of the frozen north. When they sang their war songs, their howls carried across the water like the winds of wolves. As September sails, the great fleet crossed the North Sea. They landed first in the Orkney Islands, gathering additional forces before turning south toward England's coast. Smoke and steel announced their arrival with Norsemen, entering coastal settlements, firing villages, and raising tribute. Vulnerable towns rose from the burning sight of their approach. The fleet then slid into the Humber River, a serpent cutting into England's heart. Their destination was York, the great northern city, a prize that would give them control over the entire region. But first, they would have to face the English forces that could muster against them. English nobles in the form of two young earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. These forces came north, desperate to stop the invasion before it could gain momentum. They commanded a respectable force of 3,000 men, nothing compared to the battle-hardened army. On September 20th, 1066, the two armies met at Fulford Gate outside York. The English, led by Edwin and Morcar, charged from the front, their banners streaming. For a moment, it seemed the fury of men defending their homeland might break under the ferocious Norwegian assault. Harald Hardrada had conquered half the known world. But Harald Hardrada had not come forward by accident. He let the English press into him, drawing them into marshy ground where their momentum would falter. Then, with the timing of a master tactician, he unleashed his counterattack. The Norwegian shield wall surged forward like an iron tide. English axes met Norwegian steel. A clash that echoed across the Yorkshire countryside put the outcome beyond doubt. The battle raged for hours, but Harold's veterans systematically destroyed the English forces. Edwin and Morcar fought bravely, but bravery alone couldn't overcome superior numbers and experience. When the slaughter finally ended, hundreds of English bodies littered the field. Many drowned in the marsh. The earls themselves barely escaped with their lives, their armies shattered beyond repair. York surrendered without a fight. The citizens opened their gates to avoid the fate that had befallen so many other cities. Harald Hardrada and Tostig entered the ancient city in triumph. The north lay clear. They accepted hostages and tribute, accepting them as a unified population from the terrified population, and before them lay the road to the English crown. But 300 miles to the south, King Harold Godwinson had been waiting for news that would change everything. Instead of William of Normandy's invasion fleet, threatening England's southern coast, came that his dangerous exiled brother had returned with the most powerful Viking army ever assembled. The final test of his reign was about to begin. Harold Godwinson stood in the great hall at Westminster, his weathered hands gripping the wooden edges of a table. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across maps. His advisors and holders of England spoke in hushed tones, their faces grave with the weight of impossible choices. 2 invasions, 2 directions, 2 threats to his kingdom. For months, Harold had kept his eyes fixed on the southern coast, positioned along the English Channel. Every dawn brought the possibility of William of Normandy appearing on the horizon. He claimed the throne of England, had made his intentions clear, and was backed by papal blessing. The threat from the south was real, immediate, but now York had fallen. His earls Edwin and Morcar lay defeated and scattered like leaves in an autumn storm north of the city. Harald Hardrada had accomplished what no Viking king had done in decades, carved out a foothold in the hearthold of England, an invasion that flowed only to London in wealth, power, and banner. Harold's decision came not from careful deliberation, but from the king. These fires burned in every English land. This land was his heart. These were his people. No matter what Normandy or Norway would claim, England belonged to him. The south would have to fend for itself. The real threat was here, in the north, where a giant Viking king sat in York, demanding tribute and hostages. Harold drew a breath. Messenger riders rode hard through the night, carrying orders that would echo through history. Gather up the furred troops. Call every household from every shire. The race north with all speed. The march that followed was one of the most remarkable in medieval warfare. From London to York stretched nearly 200 miles of rough, muddy tracks and treacherous terrain. Most armies, with their siege trains, baggage, equipment and provisions, would take weeks to cover such distance. But Harold's force moved like a storm. The English housecarls formed the backbone of this desperate march, professional warriors who had sworn their lives to Harold's service. They wore mail shirts that gleamed like silver scales, carried long-boned axes that could cleave through shields, and bore the quiet confidence of veterans. Behind them came the Fyrd, the citizen soldiers called up from villages and towns across southern England. Farmers who had set aside their ploughs for swords, craftsmen whose hands now gripped war hammers instead of tools, merchants who traded scales for spears. They marched day and night, their boots pounding. They kept to ancient Roman roads that connected England's great cities. They marched from dawn to darkness, gathering reinforcements from loyal shires along the route. By the time Harold's army approached Yorkshire, it had swollen to perhaps 7,000 men, tired but determined, ready to fight for their homeland. The Norwegian camp buzzed with activity as dawn brightened on 25 September. Harald Hardrada had grown confident in the 5 days since Fulford. His victory over Edwin and Morcar had been so complete, so devastating, that he believed no English force could challenge him for weeks. He had come to an agreement with York citizens. Hostages and tribute were to be delivered at Stamford Bridge, some 7 miles east over the Derwent River. It was to be a simple exchange of the city's submission. The Norwegians would receive tribute, confirm their control over northern England, and consolidate their power. Harold saw no need for the full strength of his army. Many of his men remained guarding the fleet and the treasure at Rickhall, accompanied by English townsmen who had been taken as hostages. Those who accompanied Harold to Stamford Bridge carried light gear, expecting a peaceful ceremony rather than combat. The morning was unusually hot for late September. Mail shirts that had felt comfortable in the cool sea breeze now felt like ovens under the climbing Sunday. Many Norwegian warriors had left their armor behind, choosing comfort over protection. Harald Hardrada himself wore only a blue silk shirt. He wore his sword at his side, but abandoned his great mail hauberk, confident in his strength and reputation. He believed this would be a peaceful political outing. Beside his Norwegian ally, Tostig rode, bright with the prospect of reclaiming his earldom. This day represented his vindication. Harold had cast him out, chosen expediency over family loyalty. Now, with Hardrada's steel at his back, he would reclaim what was rightfully his, perhaps even claim the crown of England itself. A prize worthy of the betrayal in this moment. Stamford Bridge was a narrow bridge, built of timber and stone, spanning the gentle waters of the Derwent. Ancient willows lined the banks, their branches trailing in the current. It was a peaceful place where shepherds might water their flocks or merchants rest their horses. On this September morning, it would become the stage for the Viking final act. But as the sun climbed higher and the time for the exchange passed, unease began to ripple through the Norwegian ranks. Where were the Yorkshire nobles? Where were the promised tribute? Harald Hardrada's scouts reported dust clouds on the western horizon, but he dismissed their concerns, believing it was merely more messenger riders approaching. The truth was far more deadly. Harold Godwinson's army had covered the final miles through the night, driving themselves beyond the limits of will. They had reached the outskirts of York at dawn, surprising the Norwegian garrison. They broke through, allowing English axes to surprise the few Vikings left there. There was barely time to sound the alarm before the city guard. From the distance, Harold could see the Norwegian banners marking Harald Hardrada's position at Stamford Bridge. His enemy was divided and overarmed. For a king who had spent his life capitalizing on opportunities, waiting on the battlefield, this moment was set. The prey had called itself, the trap of destiny. As Harold's army formed up in the morning light, their shield wall, ancient formation that had served English armies for generations, they knew this was their moment, not just to defend their homeland, but to end forever the Viking threat that had haunted England's shores for 3 centuries. The last great Viking king was waiting at the bridge. Today would decide whether England belonged to Norse raiders or to English kings. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through history. Stamford Bridge, where 2 worlds would collide with a violence that would shake the very foundations of medieval Europe. The morning hung heavy with anticipation. Both armies caught sight of each other across the gentle slopes. What had begun as a collection of tribute was about to transform into something far more deadly. The Norwegians, caught between overconfidence and sudden alarm, scrambled to form their battle lines. Many still wore only light gear, their mail tunics and shirts abandoned in the September heat. Harald Hardrada's voice boomed across the field as he tried to rally his scattered forces into the familiar shield wall that had served Viking armies for generations. Harold Godwinson's army approached like a storm cloud gathering momentum. 4 days of relentless marching had forged his men into something harder than steel. Exhaustion had been replaced by the grim determination of warriors who knew this battle would decide everything. The housecarls formed the core of his force, their long spears pointing. Their axes flashed out, while the Fyrd spread out on either flank. Farmers and craftsmen transformed into instruments of war. The sight of the English king greeted the Viking army. It was both magnificent and terrible. Across the field stood the last great Viking army, their banners streaming, weapons bristling like the quills of some monstrous beast. These were not raiders seeking gold, but professional soldiers who had conquered half the known world. Yet Harold could see the fatal flaw in their position. Many were unprepared, scattered across the field without armor, vulnerable. Harald Hardrada stood at the center of his Viking army, a giant among giants, worth 1,000 men alone. Even caught off guard, his presence radiated the kind of authority that had bent emperors and kings to his will. His pale eyes swept the English lines, calculating, counting banners, assessing distances, guessing the threat. This was not how he had imagined his conquest would begin, but he had faced worse odds in the deserts of Sicily and the mountains of Anatolia. The Thunderbolt of the North would not be cowed by any English king, no matter how quickly that army had marched. 20 English horsemen rode forward under a banner of truce, their horses' hooves drumming against the wooden planks of the bridge. The lead rider called out across the field, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Was Earl Tostig among the Norwegian host? The reply came back sharp and defiant. Yes, Tostig was there, and he would not hide from his brother. What followed was one of the most dramatic exchanges in medieval history. Harold Godwinson had come himself to make a final offer, one of 2 deaths or capture for his brother. The crown would restore Tostig's lands, grant him wealth beyond measure, even share the kingdom itself if Tostig would abandon this Norwegian alliance. For a moment, the fate of England hung in the balance. Brothers divided by blood, separated by ambition and by betrayal, facing each other across a river that was less than a boundary. Tostig's refusal rang out like a death knell. There would be no reconciliation. When Harald Hardrada asked what reward English his trouble, the king's reply became immortal. 7 feet of English ground, as he is taller than other men. The message was clear as steel. The reward for invasion would be death and burial on English soil only. As the negotiations ended, both armies knew that words had failed. It was Harald Hardrada himself who was impressed by his opponent's boldness, asking the messenger who it was. The Norwegian king nodded grimly. It was Harold Godwinson himself, a man who was a foe worthy of even a king to spare into danger. The coming battle would be between equals, not a treacherous brother. The Norwegian army began its transformation from a scattered force. Veterans who had campaigned from Russia to the Holy Land fell into familiar rhythms of war. Shields locked together, spears bristled forward, and ancient songs began to rise from their throats. They sang of heroes, of Valhalla, and the glory of Odin. Their howls carried across the field like the winds of wolves, meant to strike fear into English hearts. But the English showed no fear. Their own battle cries rose in defiance and in life, voices lifted to meet the Norwegian challenge. They sang of green fields and ancient soil, of children kept safely in churches, of warriors who stood guard. This was their inheritance, and they would not yield it to any foreign king, no matter how tall he might be. The battle began not with a terrible act, but with a single charge, a courage that would echo through the ages. As the English army approached the bridge, they found their path blocked by one of the narrow spans by a great Norwegian warrior. Armed with a massive 2-handed axe, he planted himself in the center. He dared any man to pass. What followed was a display of individual heroism that belonged more to legend than to Viking life. The lone warrior cut down English warrior after English warrior, his axe rising and falling with mechanical precision. Mail shattered against his shears, words rang off his helmet, but his precious shield remained firm. He held the bridge alone for what felt like hours, buying time for his comrades to form. The English pressed forward again, but the bridge remained blocked. The giant's stand ended, not by courage, but by an English soldier who crept up beneath the wooden planks. From a small boat, he thrust his spear through the warrior. The great warrior fell, his blood staining the waters of the Derwent. The way was clear. The English army poured across like a tide, their battle cries echoing. They charged toward the waiting Norwegian shield wall. When it came, the collision was thunder. Shields shattered like silence dance, and spear met shield, flesh met steel. The death of Norwegians, despite being caught unprepared, fought with skill. Their shield wall, ancient formation that had conquered half of Europe, held firm under the first English assault, axes clashing in deadly arcs, swords flashing. These were men who had stood in the front ranks in Constantinople, who had broken Arab cavalry in the Mediterranean. But they fought with a fury born of desperation, knowing that defeat here meant the end of everything. Harold Godwinson's housecarls pressed forward with methodical brutality, their long axes designed to cleave through mail and bone. Behind them, the Fyrd pushed, farmers protecting their fields, merchants defending their towns, neither side giving ground. The battle raged for hours under the climbing Sunday. Harald Hardrada himself fought in the front rank, his great sword carving paths through the English line, his voice roaring commands above the din of combat. Beside him, Tostig fought with the desperate ferocity of a man who had staked everything on this gamble, his blade singing through the air as he tried to carve out a kingdom. But slowly and inexorably, the tide began to turn. The Norwegians, without proper armor, still felt the weight of English steel. Their shield wall, ancient formation that had conquered half of Europe, started to buckle under relentless pressure. Gaps appeared in their line, and English warriors poured through like water through a cracked dam. The end, as it often does in battle, came suddenly. An English arrow, launched from somewhere, found the gap between Harald Hardrada's collar and helmet. The last great Viking, the Thunderbolt of the North, fell, with a crash that seemed to shake the earth. His fearsome banner, that had flown over a dozen battlefields, dipped toward the bloody ground. With their king's death, the heart went out of the Norwegian army. Tostig fought desperately, trying to rally the men around him, but it was too late. The shield wall collapsed entirely, and what had been an organized retreat became a rout. Norwegian warriors fled toward their ships at Rickel, pursued by English cavalry. The slaughter was terrible, but the English victory was complete.